Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV. Just want to welcome everyone into our live feed today. We're going to be doing a live show, really just going over some of the most important and interesting cases and police incidents that have happened over the last couple weeks. So I haven't been here in a couple weeks, and I'll get to that in a second. So I definitely want to welcome everyone back, even though we did take a couple weeks off. Again, my name is Daniel. You can go ahead and follow me over everywhere at Police Law News. And more importantly, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel here over at Cops and Cons TV, please go ahead and do that and make sure you share it with your friends and family, just so everyone knows when we are going to do these live shows that you can get in. And just like we do every single week that we do these shows, going to go over some of these really interesting and just important cases that pretty much I'm sure you've heard about all of the cases that we're going to talk about today, and I'm really interested to see what people's opinions are. Now, the one thing that I can guarantee you about the cases that we're going to go through today is that there's definitely going to be some disagreement on some of these cases. The third case I'm going to go over, I did a reel of it on Instagram, and it's been the most popular, most watched one I've done. And there's controversy on both sides. So no one is happy on either side with a lot of these cases. And so we're going to get into them here in a minute. But again, yeah, I've been gone the last couple weeks. Took off to go on vacation for the 4th of July. And I know I've said it before, but my wife is from a small town in South Dakota, and we always go back to South Dakota for the 4th of July for a week or so. In the last 2 years in this tiny town in South Dakota, I always get pulled over, and I know I've told stories about that before, but this is the first time last couple years that I have not been stopped by police officers in a small town. So that was nice. I want to welcome everyone in. We've got Barella from Colorado, Melina from Houston, Steve Ladner, how's it going? Let's see, Kryanin, I know I missed him here, he's in Washington, and of course, Sergeant George, it is good to see you. Sergeant George says, let's see, along with the cases we talk about, must have been really short. Yes, that's good to see Sergeant George as well from California. All right, so this first case that we're going to talk about, and I just want everyone to know, so last night I was on the Failure to Stop podcast. It's the old show that Mike the Cop had. He's since given it to a couple other people who run it now, but I was on the Failure to Stop podcast last night. It should be it's on their YouTube channel now. It should go to podcast tomorrow, but this is the case that we covered last night, so I'm pretty familiar with it, and not only am I familiar with the case, but also all the different arguments around it. So this has been a pretty big deal. So what I'm really interested in is some discussion and debate around this case. So if I'm saying something and you disagree with what I have to say, put it in the chat. Let's really get into this and see where we disagree and really how we can just make policing better. So this case is basically, it's a mess for LA County. And this case happened on June 24th of 2023. Hey, Shaquille O'Neal, how's it going? So this happened on June 24th, 2023, this is involving the LA County Sheriff's Office. Now, the LA County Sheriff's Office is the second largest law enforcement agency in the entire country. And one of the areas that they patrol, it's called like the Lancaster area or the Lancaster District. And essentially, there actually is a consent decree, not of the entire Sheriff's Department, but essentially of this district. So what I mean by that is the Department of Justice, the DOJ, is involved in police relations and they have some kind of agreement, at least in this specific area. So, and every now and then there's a case that anti-police activists just love, where they just glob onto it and they say, this is the case that we want. Sometimes they take a case, even if it isn't relevant to all other police officers, where these anti-police activists want to say, this is the case that we're going to point to, and we are going to say, we're going to pretend, we're going to lie that this is how all 800,000 police officers behave in the United States. And this case pretty much has it all for these anti-police activists, because this case involves young white cops, older black suspects, a misdemeanor crime, a questionable use of force, and a magic catchphrase of "I can't breathe" that once you say it, it's going to go viral. So again, this happened on June 24th, 2023 over at a Winco grocery store. Now, there was a call to police, a 911 call to police officers from the employees at the store. Now, there's a little bit of a dispute of exactly what was said. And the reason why we don't know exactly what was said to the 911 is because we don't have a copy of that tape yet. We have tried to get it, and we just don't have a copy of the 911 tape. But what's been reported is that this came out to police officers. So the information that police officers had is that this was a robbery in progress. Now, a robbery is a pretty serious crime. Besides murder and kidnapping and sexual assault. Robbery, that's one of the few felonies that police officers, will take seriously. Police officers will get into different kinds of chases and pursuits in order to stop suspects of this particular crime. So it did come out as a robbery in progress. Now, some of the other information that was given is the suspect, the description of the suspect. So essentially, the suspects were described as an older black couple, a male and a female, and also that one of the things that the individual stole during this robbery was a cake. So, and again, police officers know, especially if you've been on a while, that just because that's what the dispatch says, you're reading your computer as you're going to the call, you're listening to what the dispatcher says. Now, just because they say that doesn't mean it's correct. So that's one of the interesting, hard things and, really fun things about being a police officer on patrol is that even though you're going to a call, you think you know what you're going to get, it's always going to be a little different. Sometimes it's way different, but this is one of those cases. So police officers get to that call, and as soon as they get to the call, here's what they see. They see two individuals standing outside the store who appear to be the suspects. And one of the individuals, he's an older black man, probably about 60 years old, and he's holding a cake. Well, these are the suspects of the crime. He's holding a cake. Like this makes sense. The store employees point out that those are the individuals who are the suspects. Now, here's the thing about robberies. Any police officer knows that when you rob a store or you commit a felony or you do something really bad inside of a store, most of the time those offenders aren't standing around waiting to talk to police officers in the parking lot holding a cake. So that should be a first clue for arriving police officers that, okay, yes, this came out as a robbery in progress, but we have the two suspects who could have fled. They could have left the scene, but they're not. They're just standing there, kind of sitting on like these big like decorative stones, and one of them is holding a cake. Not a typical behavior. They're not in custody. They're not being held by loss prevention. They're just standing there on their own. So this would be the first clue to arriving police officers that, okay, maybe this doesn't make complete sense exactly what was said. So a police officer gets there on scene, and the first thing he does is he does use some de-escalation tactics. He stands by the front of his door, so he doesn't just run up to the male suspect and go hands-on and put him into handcuffs. He basically stands by the front of his door and he starts to give commands. He tells the individual to put his hands on the car, he tells the individual to sit down, and he lets the individual know that he's being detained. So again, now, yes, the officer was just kind of shouting commands at the male, but that is a form of de-escalation because the police officer, again, he could have just ran up to the male suspect and then immediately went hands-on. Instead of doing that, he used time, he used distance, and he did give commands essentially telling the individual what they wanted him to do. After 30 seconds or so, when the second police officer arrived on scene, it was at that point that both police officers went over to the male suspect and they placed him in handcuffs. Now, he was verbally non-compliant, meaning he was saying that he didn't want to be arrested. He was saying that he didn't want to be in handcuffs. At one point, while the officers were placing handcuffs on the male, he said, "I'm going to bust loose." But the thing is, he doesn't. He doesn't physically resist, and he allows the police officers to handcuff. Also, during the handcuffing process, the police officers tell him, hey, you're not being arrested, you're just being detained right now It happens while they are placing the male in handcuffs. A female, she's probably a 60-year-old female, she walks over to the police officers, and she probably gets, within 10 or 15 feet of the police officers while they are handcuffing the male, and she puts a camera in their face, which is fine. That's completely legal to do. See, the thing is about this is that not only is she recording on her cell phone, the police officers are recording with their body camera footage. So the idea that police officers are irritated that she's filming makes absolutely no sense because they are filming themselves. So she walks over to the police officer. She starts filming. Now, again, there were two suspects to this call. There was definitely reasonable suspicion for police officers to detain both individuals, and they detained the male first. So what happened is one of the police officers, he then walks over and he approaches the female, again, who was standing there pretty much with a camera right in his face, and he starts to get her into custody. Now, this is where he approaches the female suspect. He pretty much immediately goes hands-on with the female suspect. What he does is he doesn't say, ma'am, you're under arrest. Ma'am, you're being detained for this crime. Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your back. He doesn't give her an advisement that she's under arrest. He doesn't tell her she's being detained. Are actually required for police officers to do. They don't have to give a warning of force. They don't always have to tell someone that they are being arrested, but it's one of those things where it is helpful for police officers to do, especially police officers who work for a department that is at any way involved with the Department of Justice. So the officer, he basically goes hands-on with the female, and she starts screaming. And I just want to say, whenever I see something like this, it kind of reminds me of that line in Fight Club, where it's like where he goes, "What did you think was going to happen?" It means, okay, so you know that the police were called, you know that you were involved. Later on, it's found out that this woman is the one who actually assaulted loss prevention employees inside. So you know that the police were called, they're handcuffing the male, you know that you are with the male, you're walking up to the police officers, putting a camera about 10 feet from their face. The idea that you also aren't going to be handcuffed doesn't make any sense. So again, she seems all surprised, and she says, and the thing is, it's like, what did you think was going to happen? So he goes hands on, and essentially when he goes hands on with the female, she resists arrest. She actively resists. She ends up on the ground. There was a takedown on the ground. Also, once on the ground, the officer does threaten to punch her. So he says something to the effect of like, "If you don't comply, I'm going to punch you in the face." And she says, she didn't seem to be that afraid of being punched in the face, because her response to that was, "If you punch me in the face, I'm going to sue you." So it's one of those things where, what was she really after in this case? Because she had to know that she was going to be detained as well. The officer, while he's trying to get her into custody, he does use pepper spray. Again, pepper spray isn't my thing. That's not my favorite force option, but the police officer does utilize pepper spray on this woman. Also, then she yells, "I can't breathe," and "Get your knee off my neck." Now, the thing about that is as she yells that, she is laying down on her back, because the police officer was trying to roll her over onto her stomach, but she was actively resisting. So here she is, she's laying on her back. The still frame from the body camera footage, when she says, "I can't breathe, you're on my neck," the police officer's hands, feet, knees, toes, every part of the police officer's body you can clearly see is nowhere near her neck. So we know that this woman is just a liar. She's just an absolute liar. The police officer does eventually get her into handcuffs. So that's the case. There's been all kinds of protests about it. One of the things that happened is that Black Lives Matter and other protesters in the Lancaster area, they went to the Winco store. That's the grocery store where all of this happened. And they basically protested at the grocery store. 30 to 40 people with signs, and they were screaming and yelling. They basically went into the store, took over the entire store, scared customers, scared staff, uninvited, obviously, and they were basically walking around protesting in the store. Now, again, I'm not sure what they are protesting, because these two individuals, the statement is from loss prevention is that they did try to steal a cake, that it wasn't actually a robbery. It was more like a theft, and then when confronted by loss prevention, there was a battery on loss prevention, which wouldn't constitute a robbery, but it would constitute a couple of pretty serious misdemeanors, the shoplifting and then the battery or assault on the loss prevention members. So, what exactly are they trying to protest here? That shoplifting should be allowed, that if you batter a loss prevention person, that they shouldn't call police officers. Like, this just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you notice, if you ever watch this video, the Winco store, they pretty much allow these protesters to do whatever they want. They don't try to stop them. They don't call police. And yeah, I mean, cakes are not felony. Cakes lives matter. But it's one of those things where it's the store pretty much has to do this. They have to give in. They have to cower to these anti-police maniacs, because if not, the way that this used to happen is it's no longer is it the mafia showing up at a local business saying, "Oh, you know what? It would be a real shame if something happened to your store." It's not that anymore. What it is, it's Ben Crump who walks in a shirt and a tie and a smile, and that's how this happens. That is how these businesses are shaken down. So that's the case that's going on right now in LA County, in the LA County Sheriff's Department. And again, the police officers did have reasonable suspicion to detain. Now, I'm not crazy about them having the handcuffs. Let's talk about the handcuffing. So just because there's reasonable suspicion to detain, that doesn't mean that police officers have to handcuff. And I know this is an issue. I've gone back and forth on Instagram and TikTok and a couple other platforms on this case that, yes, I'm not saying that the police officers did anything legally wrong when it comes to handcuffing the two individuals. Okay, so let me just put that out there now, that all of this is under that umbrella. Nothing legally wrong, nothing against law or policy when it comes to the police officers placing the two individuals in handcuffs, because there absolutely was reasonable suspicion of a crime. But my question is, do you have to put him into handcuffs? And I know that it's different. So maybe it's just the department that I worked with, or maybe it's not even the department that I worked with. Maybe just my personal style that, you don't have to handcuff everybody. And especially if you haven't conducted your investigation, here's what I mean by this. So you have two individuals. Yes, I know the call came out as a robbery in progress, but you get there, it clearly that wasn't 100% correct, because these two people weren't actually acting like someone who just committed a violent felony. So you have two individuals. They're both 60 years old. There was no, yes, they could have a weapon, but there's no report that they had a weapon. So likely two elderly people or older people. They were older people. They were likely unarmed. They didn't use a weapon in a crime. And most importantly, they waited to talk to police. They didn't leave. They didn't leave. They didn't leave the scene. They waited to talk to police. Actually, while the police officers were placing the man in handcuffs, he even says, I waited here to talk to you. I'm not trying to go anywhere. And here's how I see this, that if you're a police officer and you get to a call like this, and it's obvious that there probably isn't any real danger, because again, the two people are older who are standing there. They're waiting to talk to police. The man is holding a cake that, and he wants to talk to the police officer. So you have someone, the police officer should be wanting to conduct an investigation. And here you have a guy who wants to tell a story. Because he wants to talk to you, before you tell him he's detained, you don't have to read the Miranda warning. He wants to tell you a story. Let him tell a story. Let him talk to you. That's my personal opinion on this. And like I said, I'm not saying that it was wrong for the police officers to handcuff. They absolutely can. I just don't think that it was the best idea to do. My other issue with this is that they did not give any kind of a warning of force or any kind of an indication to tell the woman that she was under arrest. Really what you have to look at, and the question that we should be asking is, okay, there are situations where police officers immediately have to go hands-on with a suspect for their safety, for the safety of the police officer, or the safety of the public. We can all think of cases where that happens, no doubt. But, so the question that we have to ask, was it feasible? Was it possible? Was it reasonable for the police officer to give a warning that force was going to be utilized, or that to tell the person they're under arrest? So I think with this woman, especially because this has become such a huge media thing, I honestly think that for this woman, that the officer should have at least said, ma'am, you're under arrest. Ma'am, you're being detained. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. So give her the commands. Tell her she's under arrest. Give her the commands. Tell her what to do. Then you don't have to sit there and debate with her and go back and forth for an hour. But you can give her 30 seconds to comply. That just seems like a reasonable thing to do. Police officers didn't have to do that here, but this is the kind of thing that we know is not going to look great. Let's see what kind of comments we have on this. We have a lot of people who like cake, but that's great. Let's see. Diane Martin says Democrats are backing them all the way. Yes, they absolutely are. Dan K says felony different requirements for arrest. Yeah, Dan. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, every crime has a different elements to it. 6 Cent says. Not sure BLM rioters are simply here for peaceful protest. It's my opinion, but it's only excuse to do something bad. I think that can happen. Sergeant George says, coming from someone like me who loves cakes, nothing about this made any sense at all. Yeah, I'm not sure how much. I'm curious what didn't make sense, Sergeant George, about why people are upset or why the police officers acted the way that they did. Again, they did have reasonable suspicion to detain. So that was a case out in LA. LA Sheriff's Department. Now, the second case is also going to be about the LA Sheriff's Department, but this is one that's going to be a little bit different. And I think it's important. I don't like to really talk politics on the show, but this is going to be local politics when it comes to LA. So I want you to think about how the sheriff, the new sheriff, how he handled this. So the case that I just talked about was a recent case. So there was just an election. Sheriff Villanueva, he just lost the election. So there's a new sheriff. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there's a new new sheriff in LA County now. So the case that he's talking, and when the sheriff went on TV and talked about this case, what he said is that, well, we don't have all the information. We're gonna pull the officers from the street. We don't have all the information. We're gonna do an investigation. And he was, to the sheriff's credit, he was very measured about this, very measured about this case. And his name is Robert Luna, is the sheriff right now. But very measured about this case when he talked about it. But it happened under his watch. So there was another case that happened last year. So back in July 13th of 2022, there was a case that just came out, and we just got the body camera footage. Now, the difference is that at the time, July of 22, there was a different sheriff. So I'm just going to start this out by saying that the sheriff, the new sheriff, did a news conference about this case, and he called it completely unacceptable, is what he said, the actions from the sheriff's deputies. Now, to me, it seems political, because when I tell you about this case, that I'm sure the body camera footage actually just came out yesterday, so if you haven't seen it already, I'm sure you're going to. It's going to be on every national news site pretty much out there tonight and over the weekend. So it's a good thing you're sticking around here, and you could definitely hear some of the things that I promise you that the national media isn't going to talk about when it comes to this case. So let's just get into it. So this was July 13th, 2022, and essentially sheriff's deputies were driving around at night, and they conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle that didn't have any headlights. Now, that is a completely reasonable reason to conduct a traffic stop. No headlights at night, that's a traffic violation. That's a reason to conduct a traffic stop. So that's exactly what sheriff's deputies did. They conducted a legal, valid traffic stop, and they made contact with the driver. When they contacted the driver, they learned a couple things like police officers do during traffic stop. They learned that the driver did not have a valid driver's license. They also learned that he was intoxicated, that they felt that he was driving while intoxicated. So they were going to conduct a DUI investigation. Not only was he there was suspicion of drunk driving by the driver, but let's talk about who the passengers were. There were 3 passengers in the car. Well, actually, there were 6 passengers in the car, but there were 3 adult passengers in the car. 3 young women were in the backseat of the car, and they all had an infant child on their laps. 3 women, 3 infant, 0 car seats, holding the kids in their laps with their hands. So now the police officers, not only do they have someone who wasn't driving with headlights, doesn't have a license, maybe is intoxicated, now you have something totally different. Because so when you're driving in a car drunk and you have children, not only is that drunk driving, but that's also typically felony level child endangerment. Now, not only have felony level offenses for the driver, but you also have felony offenses for the mother, because the children are minors. They were all pretty much infants. All 3 of these kids were infants. So, and the mothers are the ones who decided to get in the car with someone who is intoxicated. So it's basically felony level child endangerment for the mothers as well. Now, when something like this happens, here's going to be what the process is the driver is going to go through a DUI investigation, and if they are proved to be impaired, or at least probable cause that they're impaired, they're going to be taken to jail for driving while intoxicated. May be charged with the felony child endangerment as well. The mothers, the adults who were in charge of these kids, who put these kids in this horribly dangerous situation, those individuals are going to be arrested as well for child endangerment. Now, what happens to the kiddos? So the police departments and sheriff's departments and state laws, they basically require police departments to do different things. Most of the time, what happens with the kids, it really isn't up to the police officers most of the time. Most of the time, there's a policy, there's a plan, there's a law. There's something in place that tells the police officers what they're supposed to do. And I mean, this is good. Police officers absolutely should have discretion, but having some type of a structured plan for kiddos when their parents are arrested, that's a good and reasonable thing. So what the police officers decided to do, again, it's a law or policy, is basically because the mothers were going to be arrested for child endangerment, they were going to call Child Protective Services. Now, once Child Protective Services gets involved, they can take custody of the kiddos, they can call family members, they can vet them, and they can do all of that stuff. That really is something that you want social workers to do and not police. I hope that we can all at least agree on that. So in order to, now when we get down to it, so how does that work? You have mothers who are literally clinging on to their kids, and police officers who have to make a lawful arrest of the parents and then take the kiddos and give the kiddos to Child Protective Services. Well, 2 of the 3 mothers refused to let go of their children. They were essentially using their kids like pawns and holding on to them. They refused to let go. And the police officers, and listen, all the body cam footage is out there. I would encourage everyone. Sergeant George, I agree. The children are the real victims, and that's what people need to realize. So what you have to think about here is that police officers in this situation, they have to somehow make all of this work. Well, what's the best way to do it? And I can tell you, there's about 8 minutes of body camera footage out there that I watched this morning that is really interesting. I can tell you, it's not like the police officers ordered them out and immediately snatched the kids like child snatchers, like as soon as they exit the car. No, the police officers actually talked to these women for about 8 minutes. They used crisis intervention techniques, even though these women were technically under arrest, and police officers could have immediately just gone hands-on. Instead of doing that, the police officers talked to them and negotiated with them and tried to de-escalate the situation for 8 minutes. If you watch the body camera footage, you can tell that they're really not getting anywhere, not through any fault of the police officer, but the two women are just completely unreasonable. What I mean by that is one woman, as she's clinging onto her child, again, she's technically under arrest for a felony, she's clinging onto her child, yelling at the police officers that they're going to have to shoot her. Again, not a reasonable person, okay? So you're not dealing with reasonable people here. So eventually, police officers do use force on the women in order to get the children out of their hands. And one of them has been a big deal, but let me talk about both of them. So here's the one that really people aren't talking a whole lot about, because the second one is where people have the issue with and what the sheriff called unacceptable. So the first one is the woman is sitting on the ground, and as she's sitting on the ground, she has the child in her lap. The police officer tells the woman, and they actually say this 3 different times to her. So again, I like it when police officers give a warning of force or tell people, hey, I need you to do this. If you don't, this is going to happen. I like when police officers do that because, if possible, I want police officers to avoid using force. And giving people a reasonable amount of time in order to comply, I think, is a good idea if possible. That's what the police officers did in this situation, at least with this first woman. So they told her multiple times, hey, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to take the baby out of your arms, and if you don't comply or you don't cooperate, these 2 officers are going to hold your arms while I do that. But we would prefer if you just cooperate and hand me the baby for everybody's safety. So again, they went through this with her 3 different times. So of course, obviously, everybody knows where this is going, is that the female police officer goes to grab the child. She starts holding on to the child. So 2 police officers do grab the woman's arms and hold her, and she starts screaming like she's being tortured, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the police officers are able to safely take the baby. Nothing happens. She's put in handcuffs. She gets arrested just like she should be arrested. Now the other one is a little bit more controversial, and I'm going to admit it's absolutely more controversial. Here's what happens. This is the woman. She's standing up, so she's not sitting down. So you have to think about it. If the baby falls from a seated position, the baby's going to fall. You don't want a baby to fall at all, but the baby's going to fall about a foot. Now, if you're standing up, the baby could fall 4 to 5 feet, right? So that's a more dangerous situation that you're dealing with, and you're also dealing with a more unreasonable mother. What I mean by that, this is the woman who is clinging onto her baby, and the police officer are trying to talk to her, and she's yelling, "You're going to have to shoot me. You're going to have to shoot me." Well, again, if you're trying to show police officers that you're a reasonable person and that you're a good mother, probably yelling that police officers are going to have to shoot you, not putting anything in that bucket of evidence that you're a reasonable, normal human being who can make good decisions with a child, right? So police officers do the same thing. They tell her what's going to happen. She refuses. She's saying the cops are going to have to shoot her, which obviously they are not going to do. So what the police officers do is they do the same things before. They tell her what's going to happen, and they grab her arms, and they grab the baby, but she is holding on tight, and she is not letting go. So now you have a real safety issue, that because she's holding on to the baby so tight, and it's at that point that a male police officer punches the woman in the face 2 different times. Now, there is a deputy on scene who does have control of the baby. Nothing happens to the baby, but what this is being billed as male police officer hits woman in the face while she's holding a baby. Well, yes, he does. He absolutely does. So now we have to talk about, was that reasonable? Was it not reasonable? Well, that's something that we could absolutely debate. So if you say it's not reasonable, I'm good with that. I'm 100% good with that. But what would you like the police officer to do? So what would you like the police officer to do? They already talked to her for 8 minutes. Again, she's not reasonable. She's telling police officers, screaming at the top of her lungs, that they are going to have to shoot her and kill her, okay? So again, what do you expect the police officers to do? You can't use mace or pepper spray, obviously, because there's a baby right there. You can't use pepper spray. You can't use a Dan K. If you have any answers, why don't you put them in instead of just trolling? So you can't use pepper spray. You can't use a taser. You can't use any of those intermediate weapons. At some point when you're grabbing the woman's arms and she won't let the police officer take the baby, she won't let the police officer take the baby. At some point the police officers have to do something. So, a lot of the time what police officers do to get someone in custody is they do some kind of a takedown. They do an empty hand takedown. Well, obviously you can't do an empty hand takedown if a woman or if someone is holding a baby. You can't do a takedown. So again, if you say this wasn't a reasonable thing for the police to do, I'm good with that. But what I'm not good with is you saying the police are bad, the police shouldn't have done this, without giving me an option of what they should do. So tell me what you wanted the police officers to do. Now, is there something else they could do? I'm sure there is, but tell me what it is. Don't just give a blanket that the police were bad. So the police officers arrested the woman. That's exactly what they should do. Now, what this story should be about, deputies who basically saved children from a drunk driver and from their abusive mothers. That's what this story should be about, but it's not. There's going to be protests, maybe even riots over this case. And the sheriff, unlike in the first case where the sheriff said, the one that happened under his watch, where he says, we're still looking at all the evidence. We're going to have to see what happens, the investigation. We're going to go through the investigation here. Instead of doing that, he's saying this is unacceptable. And he's basically said that the case has gone to the district attorney's office. And he's basically in the media trying to get the problem. So who was the actual problem? The women were the problem. The drunk driver was the problem. Thank God that those deputies stopped that car before 3 children may have died in a drunk driving accident with horrible mothers who were not, where the kids weren't in any kind of safe child seats. So that's that case. I'm curious to see what anybody says. And we have a lot of comments on here from a couple people saying, why are you even asking these questions? But again, Steve Ladner says, punch a woman in the face, take the child. Yeah, you got to listen to the whole case, Steve. And again, if you don't think the cops should have done that, I'm good with it. Just so you know, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, not all that long ago, there were 2 women who pled guilty of killing their kids in the same type of case. Essentially, there were 2 children who were in a car with 2 mothers. Both mothers were drunk out of their minds. One of the mothers was driving, and it was actually a single car crash. And the thing about it was actually streamed live. One of the drunk mothers was actually streaming live right before the crash. So 2 kids died, and both mothers pled guilty. So the idea that kids driving around unsecured in a car without drunk drivers, with drunk drivers isn't a dangerous or serious thing. That just isn't the case. So thankfully, those police officers were able to stop not only the criminal who was driving drunk with kids in the car, but also the criminal mothers who didn't care about their kids enough to make sure that they were with a safe driver in a car seat, which is absolutely a disgusting thing to do. But that case is going to be everywhere. So when you hear about it and you listen to it, think about what we talked about in this video, because I promise you, they are not going to tell you everything. Even the politicians who run the sheriff's department are not going to tell you everything about this case. And again, I'm good with it. If you don't think that the use of force was the best thing the officer could have done in this situation, I'm good with it. Just tell me what you want the cop to do. Tell me what you want the cop to do, and let's have a discussion there, because that's specific criticism. All right, so this next case that we're going to talk about is, and this is a case that, I said, and after I'd go over this case, I'm going to tell you a personal story about when I was bit by a dog on duty. But this case happened in Lorain, Ohio over the 4th of July weekend, and with Dixie the dog. So Dixie the Labrador dog. Now, I'm just going to put it out there. I'm a dog lover. I have 2 big Great Pyrenees type dogs. They're awesome dogs. I absolutely love dogs, but I understand that everyone doesn't. But there are so many people who like dogs. So I do put up content over on TikTok is my main channel. I do put some up on Instagram as well. Both those you can follow me over at Police Law News. views. I'll be honest, the stuff I do on TikTok gets so much more traction than it does on Instagram. But I put a video, a reel up on this on Instagram the other day, and before I came on the show today, it had 182,000 views, which again, that's by far the most watched video I've had on Instagram. So it's nothing that I'm doing different. So I know this is the case that people just really care about. So again, this happened in Lorain, Ohio, over the 4th of July weekend. So what happened was there's a woman named Tammy Kearns, and she has 4 dogs. They all look like lab mixed type dogs, maybe golden retriever mixes. But the 4 dogs got loose. So this is in a residential area, and at this point there was no call to police that anyone had been bit or as far as I know, or anything like that. But those 4 dogs were loose. And it wasn't just Tammy who was trying to gain control of her dogs, but it was a bunch of people who were in the neighborhood who were trying to gain control of her dogs as well and get them back to her. What happened was there was a dog that was running around and a police officer arrives on scene. He pretty much parks, almost directly across the street in a residential neighborhood from where Tammy is. And you can see her trying to get her dogs. So the police officer steps out of the car and a dog runs towards him. As a dog runs towards him, now there's no audio, and I'm going to get to that in a second. There's no audio on the body camera video, so I can't say what the officer said. So I'm just going to say it appears like the officer called the dog over. Now, maybe he didn't because we don't have audio, and I'll get to that in a second, like I said. But but you can see on the body camera video, but he kind of waves the dog like this. So a dog does come by him, runs up to him. He kind of waves it in. Then the dog, almost as soon as the dog gets him, it turns around, runs away. Then another dog who looks pretty much the same as the first dog, maybe like a 70-pound lab type mixed dog. Another dog named Dixie then runs towards the police officer in, a seemingly almost the same manner as the first dog. For whatever reason, the police officer thought that this dog was a threat, even though, again, it was running towards him in almost the same way. And the police officer shoots the dog right before it gets to him. The dog obviously stops because it's hit and starts to run away, and the police officer fires a couple more times, and the dog dies on scene. Dixie the dog dies right there. Obviously, Tammy, the owner, is livid. She is absolutely out of her mind, screaming and yelling at the police officer, which I get. Not only is she upset, but people come out of houses. Other people were helping, trying to corral these dogs, and basically the whole neighborhood descends on the police officer, screaming and yelling at the police officer. And this case didn't just end there. This case got so bad that there was actually protests in this little town of Lorain, Ohio, called Justice for Dixie. So they were shutting down intersections and streets, and there's all kinds of protests and signs and all kinds of stuff for Dixie the dog. People want the police officer fired. Now the officer has been the police officer has been, and I just want to say that, this whole Justice for Dixie thing, where I do not think that the police officer was in the right, but, this really does have the vibes of a Parks and Rec, rest in peace, little Sebastian. So it does have that. Shaquille Oatmeal, why did he shoot 2 extra shots? Yeah, that's a good question, Shaq. We're going to get to that here in a second. I've got the same question on that. So everyone's upset about this, and it got so much traction on social media. So not just my Instagram account with a reel that has 180,000 views, but this got so much traction on social media that the Lorain, Ohio Police Department shut down their Facebook page. That's how much shit that they were getting because of this case. So now I've got a bunch of different thoughts on this case, but let me talk to you first about the body camera footage, because obviously when you have a video that gets that many views, you get all kinds of comments. But multiple people on my video commented something like, how come you cut the audio? How come the audio isn't on there? Well, it's because the video didn't have any audio. Let me explain how some of these cameras work. So the camera that the officer was using was an Axon body camera. It's made by the Taser company. It's really one of the absolute best body cameras. It has great storage. It's expensive for police departments, but it's pretty much top of the line when it comes to body cameras. The way that it works is when it's on, it's pretty much always, the best way that I can explain it, not being a tech person, the best way that I can explain it is that it's pretty much always running, meaning the video is always going, but it's just not recording. So when a police officer hits the button, you hit the button twice and the camera turns on. Once you hit the button twice, what shows up later on in your video file is everything from 30 seconds before you hit the video. So let's say I'm going to a call for service. I step out of my car. As soon as I step out of my car, I hit the button. Well, what's going to show show when I watch my video later, it's going to show 30 seconds before I hit my 30 seconds before I turned it on is what's going to be on that video. So essentially, just think of it this way. You get 30 seconds of extra video, but no audio. The audio starts the second that you hit the button. So that's kind of how that works. So the officer in this case did not start recording until after the shooting. So that's why when the first dog runs up to him, when Dixie runs up to him, that's why there's no audio for this particular body camera footage, because he didn't turn the camera on until after. So that's the best way that I can explain why that happens. And I'm really curious to see who disagrees with me on this. Now, again, when it comes to dogs, and listen, working as a police officer, thank you, Daryl. Working as a police officer on the street, I was in uniform for 15 years before I went into detective work. But in my 15 years of working on the street, I've worked with several different police officers who were afraid of dogs. They didn't like dogs. And you know what I'm going to say? That's okay. Not everybody likes dogs. Not every person likes dogs. Sometimes police officers are afraid of dogs, and that's okay. It's okay for a couple reasons. It's because police officers have no training on how to deal with dogs. They also have no equipment with how to deal with dogs. So here's my advice. Not only, this isn't some brilliant advice that I came up with on my own. No, this is what I saw. 15 years of working on the street in a pretty big city. This is how I saw police officers who were kind of afraid of dogs. This is what they would do in situations like this. The first thing is to call animal control, because most cities and counties, again, not all cities, not all counties, but really most places in the United States have some type of animal control. So call animal control and let them handle the call. Now, while you're waiting for animal control, or even if animal control isn't coming out, what you should do as a police officer if you're afraid of dogs is don't get out of your car. Don't get out of your car, especially you are just going to make things worse. What you should do as a police officer is you should just try to do what you can to keep your eye on the dog, and maybe, try to communicate with the owners, the people who are trying to get the dog back, and block traffic. Basically, you can block traffic, you can turn on your lights and sirens, you can let other vehicles know, like, hey, there's a dog running in the street. And really, especially if a dog is running near a big street, as a police officer, you're probably going to do more good with that than getting out of the car and being one of 15 people who are trying to corral a dog. That's probably the best use of your resources anyways, because you have a car that has lights and sirens, whereas regular people don't have that kind of stuff. So stay in your car, block traffic if you're afraid of dogs. Also, if the dog is actually dangerous and you actually have to walk up to a dog, think about it. Just like Shaquille Oatmeal just said, male men and male women, they do this kind of stuff all the time. So if you do have to get out of your car, there are other different force options that you could have to try to keep a dog away. So let's say, and again, if a dog is just running loose, here's my opinion. Tell me if you guys think I'm wrong. There is no obligation for the police officer to jump out of the car and to join in the chase with the dog, trying to get the dog back into custody. Again, no obligation for a police officer to do that. But if a dog is dangerous, if a dog actually has bitten someone, or a dog is vicious, well, and that wasn't the case here, but you can use pepper spray, you can use a taser, you can use your baton. There are definitely different force options that if you absolutely have to get out of your car, there are definitely different force options that you can use against a dog. Again, pepper spray works great. Now, if we're going to kind of relate this, back to the first case, I far prefer using pepper spray on Dixie the dog than the 60-year-old black female, just to be completely honest. But that's what would work here. And again, there was just no reason for the police officer to get out of his car. The people didn't call police. The dog wasn't vicious. And again, especially if you're afraid. So I'm just trying to get into the mind of the police officer here. So obviously he's afraid of dogs, or he doesn't like dogs for some reason, which again is okay. That's not a crime. That's fine. Cops have no training or equipment to deal with dogs. If you don't like dogs, that's fine. But if you know that about yourself, hey, I'm not crazy about dogs. I don't really like dogs all that much. If one runs at me, I'm probably going to be afraid. So why put yourself in a position to where you are going to react with deadly force? At least stand by your car, like in the doorway with the door halfway opened, where if the dog does run up on you, you can just get back in and close the door. So this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't think that this was a reasonable officer-involved shooting. The dog didn't seem to be vicious, and no, I get it. No one should have to take a dog bite, but it just, in my mind, when it comes to police officers and different calls for service, there are things that police officers can do before there's a use of force that, really is just such a tactical error that they're almost causing the use of force. And that's what this seemed like to me. It was 100% unnecessary for the officer to get out of his car. And again, he must have known, if this dog runs towards me, I'm going to shoot it. Like, just stay in your car. There's absolutely no reason to get out of your car. And yeah, someone had a question earlier. I can't remember who it was, but someone had a question earlier and asked, why did he shoot more than one time? Well, no, that makes sense, because after the first shot, the dog stops and starts to cry and immediately changes direction. So, well, I mean, you just have to think of it this way: a police officer are typically trained to shoot at least twice. A lot of times, a failure drill is 3 rounds. So, when police officers go on the range, the vast majority of the time, they're not firing just one shot. So, my guess is it was just muscle memory. And there wasn't any other reason to it other than that. But yeah, justice for Dixie. So, okay, we're going to end the show here in a second, but I said I would talk about a time where I was bit by a dog on duty. I was bit by a dog on duty when I was, it was my second year on back in 2007. And it was the first and only time I was ever bit by a dog. I was driving, working graveyard, not a great area of town. As I was driving down the street, I noticed that there was a dog laying in the middle of the street, kind of like a residential street, but not, not like a highway, but kind of like a 2-lane road, to 2 lanes in each direction, moderate traffic at night. I noticed that there was a dog laying in the middle of the road, and at that point, I didn't know if it was. I assumed that it had been struck by a car, but I didn't know if it was dead or alive. So I do what I should have done. I called out over the radio. I stopped my police car behind the dog, and I got out just to see what was going on with it. And I could tell the dog was still alive. It was pretty sad. Dog was definitely still alive, but this thing was injured. It was going to be fatally injured. I mean, this thing didn't have a whole lot of time. So I called animal control, just like I should have done. Animal control got there really quick. It was like 11 o'clock at night. They work, 24/7 pretty much. So animal control did get there on scene. The little guy with animal control, he said to me, all right, listen, here's what we're going to do. This dog was about an 80-pound dog. It wasn't a small dog, but, kind of a bigger dog and a small guy who worked for animal control. And he said to me, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a muzzle on this thing. And then he gave me some gloves. He said, I'm going to put a muzzle on this thing. He's like, I'm going to grab the front of the dog, kind of by its head. And when I do, can you grab the back of the dog, kind of like by its back legs? And if you could help me lift it up, we're going to put it into the back of the van. And, we can get it taken care of, and it's probably going to have to be euthanized. And I said, yeah, of course. I don't mind helping. Of course I'm going to help. So he backed up his animal control truck right to where the dog was. I put gloves on. He said, okay, I got the muzzle on the dog, and I could see something over the dog's face. He put a muzzle on the dog. He lifts up his end of the dog. I lift up the back end of the dog. He gets his end of the dog in, and I'm taking a couple steps to swing my end around. Somehow the muzzle of the dog comes off, turns around, and it bites me in the hand. Bites me in my right hand. It felt numb. I'm not going to get into it, but obviously it wasn't any fun. First thing I'm going to say, not the dog's fault. Not the dog's fault. 100% not the dog. This dog is just being a dog. It was the fucking animal control guy's fault, because however he put the muzzle on, he didn't put it on correctly because the muzzle came off. So, for about 2 days, I wasn't able to move my hand, had to take off, all that kind of stuff. But that was the one and only time that I was ever bit by a dog on duty. But it was not the dog's fault. It was the animal control guy's fault. And second, it was my fault for trusting the animal control guy. So, yeah, that was my story about being bit by a dog on duty. Only happened one time in 15 years on the street. All right, so that's going to be our show for today. I really appreciate everybody coming in and the questions. Just like we do every week, I check the chat throughout the week, and I definitely check the chat throughout the week. So if there is a case that happens, or you think something I missed, or you think just something interesting out there that we should cover, definitely put it in the chat, because I definitely check that all week, and I love to go back and forth with people. So again, if you haven't already, please go ahead and follow me pretty much everywhere over at Police Law News. And more importantly, please go ahead and subscribe to our channel here over at Cops and Cons TV. Make sure that you share it with your friends. And I hope that everyone has a great and safe weekend. Thanks.